Hi, my name is William Flinn, and this is my PowerPoint on bias in standardized testing. So I chose to research bias in standardized testing because it is something that I had heard of in the past, but I could never quite understand how it was possible or how it worked. In my opinion, standardized tests should be fair and balanced and free of any source of bias. So to hear that they were not was something that really surprised me. So I wanted to kind of look deeper at how tests could be biased and who they were biased against. This is a topic that I don't really recall being taught during my elementary ed courses at Iowa, during my certification courses. So to hear it, I was very surprised, and I wanted to learn more. In terms of how this topic relates to our course, well, we've been learning all semester about the importance of a multicultural education. We have students from all different cultures in our classrooms, and we need to make sure that everyone feels welcome, regardless of their culture, their religion, their age, their economic status. We need to make sure that everybody feels safe and feels welcome, and that they're able to do their best, and if standardized tests are biased, then that's not fair to students from different cultures or social classes. We need to have tests that are free of bias so that we can better assess our students in terms of what they know and what types of assistance they need moving forward, whether that is enrichment or remediation. So in terms of sources of bias, through my research I found 4 sources of bias. The first 3 came from Schultz and Fortune, who said that the first one is instrument bias, and this would be where an entire test is biased against a group of people for one reason or another. The next one that they talked about was item bias, and this is where a specific question or a specific group of questions are biased on a test. And usually this is because this is information that students haven't been exposed to. For example, some students may have been, out of the classroom. They may have been pulled out for extra help, and then a topic, a skill, a concept was covered in class, and then they're being tested on it. And so that shows that this test is biased against them, or at least that question is biased against them. Now, it could also be due to unfamiliar language on the test, whether it's ESL or whether it is, using that academic language that some students just aren't used to and are trying to figure out. So that's how they explained item bias. And then finally, we had interpretation bias, and this is where the results of an assessment are misinterpreted, whether that's by a teacher, by a counselor, or by an administrator. And the danger in that is that it can lead to tracking of students, whether that's individuals or certain groups of students being placed in certain tracks, and therefore the bias here is in the interpretation. Castanel Jr. and Castanel talked about test readiness as a form of bias, and they talked about how some groups, specifically low-income groups, are simply not prepared to take standardized tests. These students, they don't have a lot of experience, so they're thought of as less test-wise. These students also experience more anxiety when taking their tests. And then in some cases, these students just simply don't take standardized tests that seriously because, they view it as a small part of assessing what they know overall. So in terms of how to overcome this bias, well, big picture-wise, Marbley, Bonner, and Berg say that we just simply need more people of color in the field of testing, and this is going to help eliminate some of this bias that we see. Specifically, they call for more folks as researchers, clinicians, educators, and then test writers and creators to help eliminate some of that bias. We also need to look at and use standardized tests as just simply part of a portfolio of student assessments, and by that, I'm saying let's not make recommendations for enrichment or remediation based solely on the results of a single test, but instead let's look at the big picture and incorporate classwork, projects, participation, motivation, effort into whether or not a student should be placed in a pull-out group or whether they should receive enrichment in some form or another. So in terms of realizations for me as I was working through this this research, it hit me that standardized tests are in fact biased and that they have been for years. One of the articles that I recall that jumped out to me was from Zwick, who talked about SAT scores, and there was a statistic in terms of the percentage of students with at least an 1100 on their SAT with the math verbal combined, and it said that 28% of Asian Americans achieved an 1100, 25% of white students achieved an 1100, 8% of Hispanic, and 3% of the African American students that took the test achieved that score. And that's a huge jump from 28 to 3%, and so something is going on there. And similar results were shown based on socioeconomic status. So students from a lower socioeconomic status oftentimes had lower scores. So that tells you that there's some bias in that test as well. And I think the other big realization was that we need to be careful interpreting scores of standardized tests. The score that a student achieves is not the be-all, end-all, but instead really just part of a larger picture of who they are in their academic life. So how to combat standardized test bias in your classroom? First, I think, is realizing that the tests are biased against some of your students, so you kind of take those results of the tests with kind of a grain of salt before making too many big decisions based on the test. And then again, using the portfolio approach with student recommendations. Again, the test scores are just one part of a large picture, so we shouldn't rely simply on these scores for enrichment or remediation recommendations. This can result in tracking, and this can result in racism and classism with our students. Here are my references for my research report. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.